Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host of our program. With us today is one of our regular commentators, Regina Nelson, who is in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Studies in the College of Education and Development at Western Michigan University. Good to see you, Regina. Don Cooney, who's also one of our regular commentators, is on assignment, as we say in the media world. But we have a very special guest with us, a return visitor, Paul Clements from the Department of Political Science.
Thank you.
At Western Michigan University. And Paul is also one of the founding chairs of the WMU Climate Change Working Group, still very active with the working group on campus. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
Glad to have you with us once again.
Yep.
What I wanted to focus on for the program this time around was the recent climate conference that was held in Egypt. This was the 27th conference of the parties fitting within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so I thought it might be helpful just to have a little bit of background about what the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is all about and how it led to these conference of parties and sort of how this whole process has unfolded over many years now, that we are still needing such conferences so far down the road. So why don't you give us a little background on that?
Sure. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, got established in 1992. So that's sort of the time when the international community, almost all the countries in the world are part of it, agreed that climate change is really serious, and the commitment back in 1992 was to avoid serious anthropogenic interference with the climate system, right? Well, obviously that hasn't happened. Obviously we're seeing that serious interference, long ago. So the conference of the parties are just the parties, which are the governments of these countries, the parties to that UNFCCC, to that convention. And they don't meet every single year, but almost every year. And so this COP27 then is the 27th meeting of Conference of the Parties to this convention that started in 1992. So back then, in 1992, they said they're going to get serious. And the first really significant step forward was in 97 with the Kyoto Protocol. And the initial agreement was that because the advanced countries have basically caused the problem of climate change with our carbon pollution, that the advanced countries would go first, and then the developing countries would sort of be brought in later, but they had a right to development, so they would have some chance to continue to industrialize while the advanced countries took the lead in reducing their carbon emissions. That was the agreement in 92, but when they came out with the Kyoto Protocol, which sort of put that in place, the European countries came on board, but United States, our Senate, Bill Clinton, our president, wanted to sign it, but the Senate voted against it. And as you've written about, that was substantially due to a major multi-million-dollar lobbying effort by the carbon industry in the United States. Well, without the one global superpower on board, the Kyoto Protocol was basically not going to have much of a chance. And in fact, indeed, we've seen the carbon emissions not only not go down, but global carbon pollution has continued to increase just about every single year between 1992 and now. So the problem has just gotten worse all the time. So after 97, the next big event was 2015 with the Paris Agreement. And this time we did get all the countries again pretty much on board. This time the agreement was, in part obviously between 97 and 2015, there had been so much increase in industrialization in China and in many other countries. But in any case, in the Paris Agreement, all the countries said, all right, we're all committed to reduce carbon emissions one way or another, although when they say reduce, for many developing countries, what reduce meant was reduce from our current trajectory. So instead of increasing our carbon pollution by 4 times, we'll only increase it by 3 times. And that was taken to be reduce in the Paris Agreement. Because again, with the feeling that they have a right to development. But United States was a major, the sort of the big thing behind the Paris Agreement that allowed it to happen was China and the United States coming to agreement, because we are the two biggest current polluters, and the United States is far and away the biggest historic carbon polluter. So, and geopolitical power, the Europeans were already on board. So once the United States and China came together, that allowed Paris Agreement to go forward. And the Paris Agreement, you probably know, the specifics was to limit global warming to no more than, in fact, well below 2 degrees Celsius, and to try to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, even then, in 2015, looking at what it would take to limit it to 1.5, it was clear it was going to need a very rapid, instead of increasing global emissions, reducing them. And again, we haven't seen that. We had President Trump try to pull us out. In fact, he succeeded in pulling, very briefly, pulling the United States out of the Paris Agreement. And we need to see that the commitments in the Paris Agreement, every country made a commitment, but they're all commitments on paper. There's no sanction. So everyone said, this is what we're going to try to do. And the commitments at that time, although the target was 2 degrees Celsius, the commitments would have led us to something around 3 degrees Celsius of warming, all right, if the countries came through with them. But there's no sanction, no effect if you don't come through. So the commitments themselves were pretty iffy. But they said, we're going to keep trying.
Wasn't the language at Paris that each country was going to have a nationally intended contribution?
Right, intended
to the
national
reduction?
Contribution. Right.
Intended. And it wasn't billed as a treaty. It was not a formal treaty. It was an agreement to voluntarily make these contributions to the reductions, right?
That's right.
And the reason for that, if I'm not mistaken, is that President Obama realized that there was no way that a treaty could get through the Senate at that time, right? That there was not just like back in '97, when the Senate would not ratify Kyoto, probably Republicans would have filibustered and prevented a treaty. And of course, it would take, what, 2/3 of the Senate to ratify a treaty anyhow. So I think John Kerry was Secretary of State at the time, President Obama. Both were concerned that the language had to be very precise to indicate that this was not a treaty that would require Senate ratification, but an agreement in which voluntarily countries had come together, including the United States, to volunteer to make contributions to the reduction in carbon emissions. Is that an accurate assessment?
That's certainly accurate with regard to the United States, but it's also true that in 2015, for many of the other countries around the world, there would have been uncertainty, there would have been concerns also about a legally binding treaty. There are a lot of countries that would have hesitated to join a legally binding treaty, although certainly the United States, once the United States was out, then that kills it.
Right, right. If the United States isn't going to do it, then it's going to be very difficult to get the rest of them to come along.
Right.
So when you say that, again, there are no sanctions because it's not a formal treaty, so there's nothing that's legally binding about the voluntary contributions that countries are making. So
Right.
if they're not following through, I mean, isn't there a mechanism to didn't they come back in 5 years and assess where they were in terms of how people were progressing with their contributions? But again, there's no formal sanction, legal sanctions or legal accountability that can be put in place, right?
Yeah, there's roughly every 5 years a global stock take to see where we are. And sort of the intention is to have stronger commitments at each global stock take.
Okay. Well, should we get to what happened in Egypt then? So Conference of Parties 27 meets in, was it Sharm el-Sheikh, I think, Egypt, the Red Sea resort. And it was kind of interesting. I was traveling some at the time and I wasn't really paying too much attention, but it didn't seem like there was a lot of news coming out of Egypt with regard to the conference. But they did end up with one very significant breakthrough, right? What was that, Paul?
Well, and it's mostly a symbolic breakthrough.
Okay, even there.
But they agreed to have some kind of fund for what's called loss and damage. And this needs a little bit of background, all right? That is to say that with the Paris Agreement, there was an agreement that the advanced countries would put up a fund of $100 billion a year by 2020 to help the developing countries with mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, transitioning to clean energy, and adaptation, adapting to the various harms from climate change. The developing countries, back in 2013, they've been arguing all the way along that, well, look, as well as like adapting, and as well as reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, we are far more vulnerable to the various harms from climate change, basically because we have more severe weather and we're already hotter in terms of geography. And since you guys caused this problem, but we're suffering all these harms, we know that we're not going to be able to avoid those harms. So they're going to hurt our GDPs, they're going to hurt our people, and so you should help us for the cost of these things. And so they called the Warsaw International Mechanism in 2013, but it didn't have any money, and it's just sort of to say, kind of discuss to get information. And so the developing countries have been pushing all the way along for some resources for loss and damage, meaning to help them deal with the harm. Like Pakistan was pushing hard on that this year because they just had these enormous floods, flooded 30% of the country and displaced tens of millions of people. And it's a big hurt to their GDP, and they just have to bear that. And they're saying, well, look, you guys caused this problem. You should help to cover these costs. So finally, after pushing and pushing and pushing, there's this so-called breakthrough. We will have a loss and damage fund, except we don't know how it's going to work. And in terms of the commitments that were made in Egypt, the commitments were for a total of $230 million, which is like less than $1 billion, when this other fund is supposed to be $100 billion. Just so we get things straight, we committed to $100 billion from the advanced countries back in 2015.
That was called the Green Climate Fund?
Well, the Green Climate Fund is a piece of that.
A piece of that, okay.
But in the last couple of years, it was supposed to be by 2020, and we haven't ever gotten more than 80 billion. So the advanced countries haven't come through with their commitment to 100 billion, even by now, 2022 per year. And so then this is another little piece, another, basically a drop in the bucket for loss and damage. But the developing countries, what they could feel positive about is that there's an agreement to do something. And then, as in so many of these things, in terms of climate change negotiations, well, we'll get started with something with the hope that it could be strengthened in the future. And we'll just have to wait and see on that one.
Yeah. Regina, we've talked a lot about environmental justice issues.
Exactly. So I guess my big question is, we're in a wait and see about the loss and damage to see how this will play out. But how well has the funding for the adaptation been used in these areas? Has that been promising? Even the little bit of funding that they have access to, has it made a difference?
It's been a disaster.
Okay.
Frankly.
Okay, so we can predict that we'll see similar results for the loss and damage based on this?
Well, likely in terms of any kind of efficiency or any kind of focus on vulnerability, it's going to be problematic. If we look at this, let's call it 80 billion. All right. The first thing is this 80 billion is channeled through literally hundreds of organizations. So any kind of efficiency is very questionable. And then there's loads of double counting. Like sometimes it'll go through first, let's say, World Bank, and then it'll go through a national, an implementing agency, and that'll just get counted twice. A lot of this 80 billion is just loans, so you have to actually pay it back. So how should that count? And then in the Paris Agreement, they agreed to a balance between mitigation and adaptation, because the developing countries said we should have a fair amount for adjusting to these effects. But that hasn't really happened, that most of the money has gone for mitigation, which is more the priority of the developed countries. And then even the money that has gone for adaptation, it comes through, you have to put like requests in for particular projects. So the countries that are good at doing this, which are more the middle income countries, get more of the money. And wherever it's coming, it's sort of more or less controlled by the governments and by the international agencies. And they have never been very good at supporting the most vulnerable. And so the people who are most hurt by this, even with the existing systems, and this is very well documented, are not getting the support that they really deserve. So any kind of sort of justice perspective that's saying, well, the people who are hurt the most, who are most vulnerable, who contributed the least, they should certainly get helped. We're not seeing much of that.
Unfortunate.
Did the United States make any specific commitment to this loss and damage fund? It's supposed to be some kind of a dedicated fund. There wasn't any specific number that was.
Yeah, the United States didn't, said we're going to look at it.
Didn't the Biden administration say it was going to pledge like $2.1 billion towards the climate justice issues at some point?
I haven't heard that number.
Okay.
Certainly the Biden administration has a lot more positive rhetoric on these things, but let's remember that the Biden administration can't speak for Congress.
Right, and that's where the money has to come from.
Right.
I just feel that it's important to point out to everybody who's listening to this discussion about money for dealing with climate change is that the United States Congress just passed a new defense bill, and it provides over $800 billion to the Pentagon. And of course, there's other military spending that's in the budget for the Department of Energy for nuclear weapons, for example. So it's actually over $1 trillion. And in fact, the Congress provided $45 billion more than even the Biden administration had requested, right? So what are we talking about here? Something million, did you say?
Yeah.
For dealing with the most, one of the most important issues in human history, right? Dealing with climate change, dealing with the loss and damage created by climate disruptions. And we're basically talking about peanuts compared to what we provide for our military. So the United States Congress can say, oh, there's $45 billion laying around here that we can push over here and give it to a military that's already getting close to $1 trillion a year. So I think in terms of just thinking about the warped priorities just of our own country, and again, the inability or unwillingness of most of the developed world to really step up to the plate here and deliver some substantial funding for such a critical project. I just think it's appalling.
It's appalling, and it's terribly short-sighted, and even from a very narrow perspective of U.S. national interest, it's really dumb. Because the United States, it's going to be our people who are also going to be hurt from climate change or from the failure of these various systems. So it's wrong in so many ways.
So we have a loss and damage fund, sort of, and this was billed as the big breakthrough, right, of the conference. This was what was being touted by the UN and by others as the big breakthrough for the conference. One other issue here that I want you to just talk about briefly. China is listed by the UN as a developing country. Is that correct? And if I'm correct on that, then what implications does that have for this fund in terms of China paying in or China receiving funds out of whatever kind of loss and damage does get created?
So the division of countries for the UNFCCC got established in 1992. And we still have that same division from 1992. For all the countries that were listed as developing countries then are still listed as such. And obviously in the intervening period, China has become, one of the leading industrialized country in the world. And on a per capita basis, maybe somewhere around a third of the United States in terms of income, but nevertheless, not really a developing country the way you think about it. And so that is still the categorization. So in principle, China could be eligible for this loss and damage money. It's not going to happen. I think that really the more fundamental issue with China is that China still has planned only to level off their carbon emissions before 2030. So they're still increasing their carbon pollution. They depend a lot on coal. Interestingly, they're way ahead of the United States on solar, but they're also still increasing their coal, partly because they still have this growing industrial economy. And so China, they want to increase their carbon emissions. And this is a very sort of delicate set of questions, because on the one hand, they say that, well, look, we have a right to development just like what you had, and your per capita GDP is more than twice what ours is, so we should be able to continue to industrialize. And if you look at the way the 1.5 degree target is set up and the sort of politics that it frames a politics that doesn't work well for the low-income countries that are still trying to industrialize. Because it's saying everyone has to try to just reduce and reduce and reduce. And China is in this middle position, okay, where they've industrialized quite a lot, but still not as much. So, the Europeans tend to take a principled position more strongly in these negotiations than the United States. Sometimes they're behind 100%, sometimes not, but they're the ones, and so the Europeans were saying, no, that we have to, if we're going to have this fund, it has to be focused based on vulnerability, and based on vulnerability is not going to go to China because they're a middle income country. But there's another issue there behind that, and that is to say, let's say if you look at India, and India is a good example because their per capita emissions are still less than half of the global average. The global average is about 5 tons per person per year. India is just around 2 tons per person per year. And they depend a lot on coal. They still have a lot of poverty. They've got a growing economy, So India, they're saying, well, we need to continue. They're moving, like China, they're moving pretty rapidly towards solar, but they're increasing solar while still increasing coal because they're growing their economy. And so they were one of the ones, India and China, who in these COP27 in Egypt were saying, we're not prepared to increase our commitments towards 1.5 because 1.5 degrees Celsius, because for them, increasing it towards 1.5 means giving up the right to development. That in China's case is kind of iffy. But in India's case, and you look at Ghana or Vietnam or whatever, they're in the same general position. They all need to increase their energy use, dramatically if they're going to bring their population up to what anything like the average or whatever. And so for them, this 1.5 degree target is like, well, hey, let's let us industrialize first, and then you take the cut first. Let's say you make the more rapid reductions, but that's not in the framework. So this framework kind of works against those low-income countries that are still needing to industrialize. And again, if they were getting all this help from the advanced countries, it would be another story. But the help on mitigation isn't close to what would be needed for them to sort of like jump over carbon pollution, jump over coal and oil, and go directly to solar and directly to wind. They just don't have the resources for that.
No, that's helpful, because I was thinking, okay, you're still developing, but a slower rate of development would be okay. But now that you've just explained it, it's not. To deal with the poverty issues and the infrastructure issues in their countries, they need to develop at a rapid rate.
Yeah, that's how they see it. And I think there's some good reasoning behind that in terms of being kind of fairness.
Right.
When we're looking at contemporary problems, it's always vitally important to keep that larger historical context in mind, isn't it? Because, in terms of historical and cumulative emissions, the United States and the European Union are way, way, way out there. China now currently, on an annual basis, has a greater amount of emissions than the United States does. So if you're only looking at it in the current period and you say, well, look at China's the problem, look at all their emissions, but you're not thinking about that larger history.
Right.
It's kind of like with regard to the race issue too, right? I mean, people want to say, well, let's forget about slavery and the failure of Reconstruction and Jim Crow segregation and just look at today, right? But you can't do that. You can't ignore that historical social structure that's there, that's in place, because it so conditions what's happening today. And yet that seems to be the way, at least in terms of the United States. I mean, when people started hearing that there was going to be this loss and damage fund, there were Republican senators who were getting all huffy. Well, we're not going to give Joe Biden the ability to create that kind of a fund, and always insisting. I think this goes back to Kyoto, that the insistence was, well, the developing countries have to also be part of this. They have to contribute. It's not just going to be us. Well, it has to start with the developed countries. It has to start with the U.S. in particular, or it's almost impossible to get the rest of the world to come along unless you take that larger historical context.
That's right, and very practically speaking, the developing countries like India, places, they're saying, well, we're just not going to join. We're not going to agree if the advanced countries, and particularly the United States, don't take some responsibility for all their enormous contribution to this harm, where we're suffering the most from it. And I mean, here in the United States, if a corporation pollutes a town, people in that town can sue the corporation, right? Because it's killing them, right? But in our international structure, India or Tuvalu, this island that's going to be flooded, can't sue the United States in our international structure. But if we want any kind of agreement that has any semblance of fairness, then those countries say it's got to include some responsibility. And the loss and damage fund is a tiny incremental step towards basically ineffective implementation of that responsibility.
Some of the language that I saw coming out of the conference, that there was a new focus on accountability this time around for businesses and other institutions. What does that mean, and how did that affect the overall discussions that went on in Egypt this time around? Have you read anything about this new emphasis on accountability, and what does that really mean? Because just the discussion we've been having so far seems to imply that there hasn't been historically very much accountability for those who've contributed the most to the problem. What is this new focus on accountability, and how's that going to work, if at all?
Well, I mean, I don't know what you're hearing, what you're reading. The only thing that I can imagine that would have an element of accountability is the loss and damage fund, which doesn't have any serious accountability. It's just a sort of, again, a voluntary thing. But if you look at all the other work that was going on, there were various efforts that were trying to increase particular lines of work to increase opportunities for mitigation, for reducing greenhouse gas pollution. But in terms of, let's say, for example, the corporations that are still pushing hard to increase their oil and coal productions in many cases, and in terms of countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and so on, where their national economies are built on oil exports, there's no semblance of accountability for any of them. And there certainly was nothing in that conference that would in any significant way bring about that kind of accountability.
Well, it was something that I saw. It was a UN document that said 5 takeaways from the conference, and one of them was this new focus on accountability. And I think in framing that, they also talked about the fact that we're not going to allow corporations to engage in greenwashing, which I thought was particularly interesting, because we just got a new report, didn't we, from the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. Regina, did you see that report and what it had to say? Or
no, I have not seen it. But
it mostly focused on the issue of greenwashing, that corporations, the big oil in the United States in particular, has been engaged in a considerable amount of greenwashing over the years. They talk a good game, like they're going to be partners and join in helping reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and yet in terms of their actual efforts, they're doing almost the opposite. And so this House committee basically really was slamming big oil, saying, you know, you're putting out all this propaganda, all this greenwashing that you're really doing something, but in fact you're not. You're still engaged in business as usual, and you're still part of the larger problem here.
And let's be clear, United Nations has absolutely no power to enforce anything about greenwashing.
Right.
So I can well imagine that they're pushing some kind of better reporting standards and more consistency in reporting. And then they would view, well, if we have more information, that's a potential step towards accountability. But then, let's be serious, politically, you have to then use that information. And as you're describing, the political will is just not there to enforce any kind of meaningful reduction or getting rid of greenwashing, and we see that greenwashing all the time. So I mean, it seems to me like this is UN rhetoric.
I mean, are there examples of countries that can be leaders or models for zero emissions, moving towards this and honoring this without sanctions, without accountability, just doing what they're supposed to do?
Yeah, I mean, Sweden's doing pretty well. Denmark is doing pretty well. I teach a class on climate change issues, and I've used Scotland, partly because all this stuff is in English. But Scotland has a really good plan for becoming net zero by 2045. And basically they had like, out of a population of 5 million people, 2 million of their citizens were supportive of civil society organizations pushing for this back in 2008, 2009. And then in 2012, I believe it was, there's this Climate Change Scotland Act that set, then they put their target as 2050, but then they've strengthened their target, and they just started doing all the work. They worked through all the different sectors of government, of society, in terms of vehicles, in terms of industry, in terms of households, and they just had all their parts of government that are involved in energy working with the normal stakeholders. So it's not as though it can't be done.
Right.
It's just a rational, logical process to do the work. And we can see in Scotland, one straightforward example of how this can be done. So it's not unattainable, but it depends on that political will. And that's obviously been what's not been present here in the United States, largely because here our carbon interests have been so strong in protecting their profits through the political process and through various kinds of disinformation and so on.
And so in Egypt at the COP27, there was a reaffirmation. I think they said the intention to continue with trying to limit warming to 1.5 Celsius, as you indicated, that was still, but it didn't seem like anything happened there that would really, okay, the loss and damage fund was touted as the big breakthrough, but it didn't seem like there was really anything that came out of Egypt that was really going to help us. I mean, isn't the goal still to reduce emissions by, 43% by 2030?
The International Energy Agency, which tracks this, says that's what we need to do to have a real chance of 1.5.
That seems impossible, though, to do, and especially impossible if a major conference like this didn't really come up with anything dramatic or any kind of breakthrough in terms of limiting emissions, mitigating emissions that pushes us toward that. Or
I mean, if you just look at the graph of emissions, all right, the graph of emissions each year has continued to go up. In 2021, because of COVID, it had a negative dip, but then in 2022 it came right back up to where, so the graph of emissions has been going up, and then to get a 45% reduction by 2030, it has to go something like that. And you just look at what is involved in that transition, and you look out around the world, and countries are not taking those steps that would be necessary for such a rapid transition to renewable energy to allow that to happen. in fact, there are so many places where investment in coal and oil and natural gas are even increasing. So I'm with you, I'm afraid. I really think the 1.5 degree target is really fiction at this point.
Oh, this is depressing.
Yeah,
like this model is not working. Do we have other models for addressing this? Because we're saying if it's corporations, then how do we hold corporations accountable if it's the countries aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Yeah, no, it is depressing, and it's all about politics. And in terms of the politics, and this is one thing that I kind of focus on a little bit, which I think is a real challenge here, is that if we look, say, at the United States, and this is true in most advanced countries, that there is a very strong political organization about different aspects of climate change, environment, and so on. But overwhelmingly, the focus is local and regional and national. And all power, more power to them. I certainly don't want to, I certainly respect and appreciate all that work that's being done. We have many wonderful environmental organizations that are pushing our government. But the reality is that the real politics here is at that international level. And until the Americans and the other advanced country citizens who really want to be effective in addressing climate change, until they can focus politically, organizationally, and politically at these international negotiations and getting our country to agree to things like loss and damage, to agree to things like meaningful adaptation, then we can't get the other countries on board. So that's a real concern.
And certainly much sharper cuts are necessary in terms of carbon emissions, and we just don't see anything coming out of this conference that's going to produce that. Although 80 countries at the conference supported a statement which concerned a transition away from all fossil fuels. But it's hard even to get a statement like that, let alone actual cuts in emissions, to get a statement that we need to transition away from fossil fuels. Even that seems like a bridge too far.
Yeah. And these statements are cheap.
Yeah, talk is cheap, right? There was some other discussion, Paul, and I know because of your interest in development, that there was something called the Bridgetown Agenda that the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, was talking about, would try to overhaul the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. What's all that? What's that about, and how does that fit into the larger framework of the conference here?
Sure. So one of the real fundamental organizational challenges with the whole climate change picture is that it requires major investments from a long-term perspective. Whether we're talking about mitigation or adaptation or anything, usually you need to spend substantial millions of dollars today, where the benefit's going to play out over sometimes 10, 20, 30 years. And so the issue of finance then is absolutely central to this. The organizations that look at these things say, well, there's nowhere close to even 25% of the finance that would be needed to achieve, let's say, 1.5 degree in terms of the rapidity of investment. These things are just well known. So how do you get that money together? Well, like you say about robbing banks, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. Where is the international money? Well, the IMF and the World Bank are like the biggest places for that. And so this Barbados Bridgetown Agenda, what they're doing is finding, I think you could say, fairly clever ways that the IMF in particular, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the way it works is it has commitments from mostly the advanced countries to back up the loans that it makes. All right, and so there are ways to basically leverage these commitments, the fund they've already committed, so it doesn't require new money, but to leverage these commitments to make literally billions of dollars available for investments that have a chance to pay off.
Right.
So it's not as though you're giving away money, but under similar terms to the way the IMF or World Bank already work, which means if you're a relatively middle income country, it's going to be near a commercial rate, and if you're a very poor country, then it's going to be at a concessional rate. And so then you can make these funds available essentially to be borrowed to then fund the new solar projects, the new wind energy projects, and so on. And there was, it didn't happen, but there was good discussion, and that agenda did move forward. So insofar as mitigation, so far, reducing emissions is nowhere near where it needs to be, this could be a big new pot of money to allow that to happen, but money that's not, for the most part, not being given away, that's still on commercial terms. And all this depends, again, on people actually doing it, governments actually getting behind it. So it's a cool idea, and I hope it works. If it does work, it's still not going to get us to 1.5.
Right.
But it's another step along the way.
Yeah, I know we were excited with the Inflation Reduction Act and to talk about here in our own country about providing these funds, but we found out that we don't really have the workforce available to use those funds to make the changes we want. I suspect it would be the same in other places around the world too. Is that an issue and limitation that we would face too, even if the funds are there?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. That it's not just a question of the money, but you also have to have the skilled people, the infrastructure and the training and the materials and so on. And so this is why these idea of 45% reduction by 2030, just practically speaking, you just look at the steps and no, it's not going to happen. But at the same time, what it means is that we need even the investments in those skills,
right?
In that infrastructure, in just the legal structure, in the financial arrangements, and even here things are moving, but moving too slowly.
Are there other things about this particular conference of parties that are interesting to focus on or important to note? There was a lot of kind of background noise about it being held in Egypt under certain kinds of political conditions that we're not allowing some of the protest activities that we often see take place here, and just kind of the organization and the infrastructure provided for carrying out a huge conference like this. Were those kind of issues that came up?
Yeah, Egypt has a very repressive government. It has hundreds and hundreds of people in jail without trial right now as we speak, and you don't want to speak against the Egyptian government if you're Egyptian, because who knows what's going to happen to you. And you'd think that Egypt could actually run like a conference, but like getting a cup of water apparently, or like finding food was like really tough. At this conference, just leave, like if we're trying to reduce carbon emissions, we can't run a conference, right? It's like a bigger job, right? But I think a more fundamental issue is that there were more representatives there from the oil industry than there were from civil society, from environmental organizations and the environmental justice community. And this is kind of scary. I mean, the oil companies sending their people there are not sending their people there to try to go bankrupt. They're doing it because they want to protect their interests. And you just kind of wonder, how's this supposed to work?
Is that, I mean, that wasn't unique to this particular conference, but is that just a flaw in terms of how the United Nations has organized these conferences, that it allows for that much greater participation by the very people whose actions are causing the problem in the first place? So again, how can we expect that we're going to have a reduction in emissions if the main players at the table are those that are causing the emissions?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to go to the fundamentals, part of the challenge here is that the UNFCCC is an association of governments, and each of those governments has their own background political interests. But climate change is global and affects the vulnerable through a global process. I mean, to me, the thing which speaks most clearly to this is the absolute neglect of climate migrants in the whole UNFCCC process. Even when they're talking about loss and damage, which is, of course, important, the loss and damage is basically looking for advanced countries' governments to give money to developing country governments, so developing country governments can address the harms of climate change in their country. Well, these governments themselves are often, like Egypt, not very democratic, repressive, authoritarian, one thing and another, and it's the actual, human beings who suffer, who experience the harms. And one of the biggest harms is climate migration. When people lose their homes and because of sea level rise or drought or floods or one thing and another, we expect, the official numbers are saying 200 million climate migrants by 2050. Okay, I think those numbers it's probably more like 400 million. And just to put that in perspective, right now there are 100 million people displaced globally by conflict and violence, refugees and one thing or another, which is already the most in human history, right? And that's mostly by conflict and violence. So if we have, let's say, 400 million by 2050, so in less than 30 years' time, there's 4 times more people due to climate change than there are total right now, and we're not even managing to give decent conditions to these refugees today. And then if you look at the countries, the developing countries that want the loss and damage money, then they, for the most part, are not investing that or putting that money to, let's say, the needs of these climate migrants. Right. And so the actual human beings who are suffering the worst are still out in the cold, even with loss and damage, because of the sort of statist structure of the UNFCCC. I think that fundamentally, the very global nature of climate change means that we have to have stronger institutions of global governance to effectively implement that. But those institutions, we're nowhere close to building those. And I think that, if we want to look at the big picture, then again, if you're thinking about climate justice organizations, the focus is national or below national, but it needs to be more at this international level. What are the international institutions that are necessary for any kind of climate justice?
The question of climate migrants, I think, is really a critical one, and unfortunately, rather than seeing any country step up or very many countries step up and in any way adequately address this, what it tends to produce then is a kind of xenophobia and right-wing reaction, and we see that in our own country, of course, but we saw that also in parts of Europe. Right. And so often then it becomes what Christian Parenti called the politics of the armed lifeboat, right? Yeah. And to me, I thought that he wrote that 10, 15 years ago, and I think we've only seen the politics of the armed lifeboat increase dramatically since then. So this seems to me to be a larger issue that's going to have to be dealt with, and yet it didn't seem like this is anything that gets addressed at these kind of conferences, right? Right.
And when you say it's got to be dealt with, that's exactly right. Because what we see in these conferences is because of it's a political hot potato, which it is, all right, because of that, they say, okay, we just won't talk about it. Well, not talking about a problem just isn't a very effective way, right? And this is, obviously, the main consequences are for the migrants themselves. But in addition to their suffering, then having all these people who are moving to someplace else and then not having a job, not having a livelihood, right? Then that turns out also to be politically disruptive in any number of ways. Plus, just in terms of the human, if we want to think of these terms of human capital, that wouldn't it make more sense to sort of find a way for them to be making a contribution rather than suffering and then in some cases causing problems? That just from a self-interest, from a strategic, realpolitik perspective, so to speak, the armed lifeboat is a disaster for the United States. The idea that we're going to be able to sort of protect ourselves from countries, governments failing around the world and protect our interests is just so unrealistic and wrong and dumb.
And it has a dramatically negative effect on our own domestic politics, right? This is part and parcel of Trumpism and the right-wing reactionary forces within the Republican Party, right?
Yeah, and this is bringing it back to the domestic level is exactly right, because we see this in other places as well. We see the issue of immigration bring up this reactionary perspective, but that reactionary perspective is blocking just rational, self-interested national policy on this. And so we've got to move to a politics that doesn't allow this reactionary objective to get in the way of just sensible policy. You know, I'm not even talking about progressive. I'm just talking about sensible, self-interested policy.
Right.
I would prefer to have progressive, but.
So just like as the average citizen, what can I do to strengthen the global climate justice movement?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Well, I'm trying to start an organization that would work on that. So, you know, my email address is clements@wmich.edu if you want to hear more about that. But, you know, the reality is that even like the Sierra Club, the League of Conservation Voters, Climate Hawks, these are all national organizations in the United States that are doing a good job. None of them have more than a sliver of a focus at the international level. Internationally, you know, I mean, Action Aid, you probably haven't heard of them. They're a British NGO that is pretty strong on this. Some of the European organizations are stronger on this. There's a Climate Justice Alliance, International Climate Justice Alliance, but even there, it has so many different sort of members that it doesn't have a strong focus at this international level. So it's a tough one.
I did see some discussion about, I think, the vibrancy and energy of the climate movement at the conference. So, but you don't see a whole lot of that, right? I mean, when you get reports from the conference, it's usually, you know, what did or didn't happen at the governmental level. And we talked about the fossil fuel participation, but there are other people there trying to demand that climate justice issues be put in the forefront, right?
Well, but as you mentioned earlier, because of Egypt being the host, Egypt basically didn't allow substantial protest.
They had to take place inside the buildings, not...
Egypt set up a location, I don't know, 10 miles away, something, some distance away.
Free speech zone.
From the conference, where like you could have like your rally, right? Anyone who wanted to could rally there as much as they wanted to 10 miles away, right? And so, unsurprisingly, it didn't get, and so there were, you know, as usual, some people within the conference who were representatives of these various international nonprofits and so on, but they're you know, just as participants, and they don't have any power there, so they can talk to people. I'm sure they did, but you don't expect, you know, as we've seen historically, they don't have a big influence.
All right, we just got a couple of minutes left here, Paul. What do you see? What's next? What's COP28 is going to be where in the United Arab Emirates? What do you expect to happen between now and then? Not much, or are there things that will move the whole process forward?
Well, sort of from a bureaucratic perspective, with the Loss and Damage Fund, they said we'll take a year to work out the details. So just to see how this is going to work. So it'll be interesting, you know, to see, because there's some positive movement there. There'll be another stock take, international stock take. I don't know if it's, I don't think it's this year, next year. I think it's another couple of years out. But you know, these big stock takes, we say, where are we now? How far have we come? And these tend to be opportunities then for perhaps stronger commitments, and we'll have to wait and see. We're seeing the price of renewable energy, wind and solar, just has, not so much in the last year, but has gone down so much in the last 10 years that it's now just cheaper, usually. And so we'll continue to see more investments in wind and solar, which is, of course, what we need. But in gathering the finance, gathering the organization for that, there are big issues with batteries, with energy storage. We hope to see some you know, positive movement in the technology, these kinds of issues. So, you know, we could hope that there are sort of marginal improvements here and there, but I don't see so far anything in the perspective that leads to suggest that there's going to be, you know, a breakthrough next year.
And I think Regina was asking, what can we do? What kind of movements can we join? I think that becomes really the critical question then, right? Because nothing is going to happen. The process isn't going to get pushed forward unless there is this demand, unless there's this larger climate movement that is a more integrated movement, an international movement, and is going to put political pressure to help stiffen the backbone.
If you want an issue that could be a lead issue, I would talk about starving children in Somalia, because Somalia has, they're about to declare famine for almost, and they already have essentially famine conditions, and overwhelmingly the causes of this are drought and flooding, which have been increasing dramatically. It's largely due to climate change, and if you're going to talk about who's the most vulnerable victims of climate change, these children losing their lives to starvation, which is a terrible way to die. This is like emblematic of the failure of the international community to really address those who are most vulnerable. And I mean, this is not just these children, but these children as representative of the bigger issue. That would be a reasonable, appropriate focus.
And at Christmas time, what better way to kind of frame that plea that we need to take that kind of action and develop that kind of commitment? Well, we're out of our time today. I'd like to thank Paul Clements for joining us. Paul, great insight as always. Thank you for helping us. Regina, good to see you again. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays to all of you, both of you, and to our viewers. I'm hoping that on our next program, when we get back in the new year, we can perhaps do kind of a retrospective on what happened in 2022 and then look ahead to 2023. You ready to focus on that? And Don Cooney should be back with us. So we invite you to come back and join us again on Critical Issues, Alternative Views. And again, happy holidays from all of us to you. We'll see you in the new year, 2023.